Welcome to the show. If you're watching on YouTube, do like and subscribe. Today, is Joe Biden the new Roosevelt? Already quite a few arched eyebrows, probably quite a lot of angry people. My cat, as you can see, is deeply perturbed by the question and has already stolen the show. Can you not? So Joe Biden has not been praised by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but she said that he's exceeded expectations. That's caused quite a lot of fury and anger amongst a lot of certainly the online US left, but equally outrage from Republicans who think that therefore confirms their worst fears. So is Joe Biden, is he exceeding progressives' expectations? And I suppose looking back, Roosevelt, not a president actually from a progressive background, but in office because partly of the struggles of the US left was forced into more progressive positions, though his presidency was more flawed than often history sugarcoats. Likewise, LBJ, huge caveats there. He carpet bombed Southeast Asia and did many reactionary things, but did some progressive things, even though he was a conservative Texan Democrat. So what we're doing today is we are joined by two fantastic guests, Waleed Shaheed, who is from many things, including the Justice Democrats, who organized to get progressive Democrats elected. He's been involved in so many campaigns to get progressive Democrats elected, such as Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, involved with all sorts of campaigns, AOC, Bernie Sanders, you name it. And we're also joined by the fantastic Kate Aronoff, who is the author of, and you must get this book out now, Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. And they have also both written chapters for another book called Winning the Green New Deal, Why We Must, How We Can. So just buy all those books. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Right, let's just kick off. I'll just throw it at you. Is Joe Biden the new Roosevelt? Let's have a little pre-seed answer. Who wants that? Who wants to start with a little summary?
Kate, it's you. You wrote the book.
Well, I wrote a book. I didn't write the book. There are New Deal historians who could say more. No, he is not the new Roosevelt, in part because I think, sometimes historical analogies can encourage sort of lazy thinking. But what is true is that Joe Biden has exceeded just about everyone's expectations for what he would do on many, many fronts, including myself. I finished the book behind me that way in the summer. Most of the writing, I finished my final edits on January 6th when white supremacists stormed the US Capitol. And at that point, I would not have expected that Joe Biden would get through a $1.9 trillion stimulus that included important expansions of the safety net, albeit temporary, and would be talking a much bigger game on climate. Would not have predicted that he would want to reduce U.S. emissions 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, which he announced last week. So all of this is much, much more than anyone expected from Joe Biden in the Democratic primary, certainly, even in the general election. He, in the primary, was the most conservative candidate on climate. But, maybe you can debate whether that was Amy Klobuchar or Joe Biden, but, was a very sort of centrist-leaning candidate on climate in the primary, and has exceeded just about every expectation for a lot of reasons. I think the ways in which he's not like Roosevelt, I'll say briefly, are that, within a month of taking office, Roosevelt had gotten a civilian conservation corps through, had implemented a bank holiday, had done sort of big things that, at the time were totally unprecedented, had gotten them through, albeit with much bigger majorities, of course, than Joe Biden enjoys right now. But it just done a lot of stuff. And Joe Biden passed a very big stimulus package, right? Bigger than anyone would have expected. That stimulus is not permanent. Checks are not going to keep going out. Unemployment insurance will not be permanently expanded. Child tax credit will not be permanently expanded. And we haven't seen any climate policy yet, which is the area where I tend to focus on. And there have been fairly underwhelming, actually, proposals as part of his infrastructure plan for climate. And they haven't passed yet. And we don't know if they will, right? We don't know if they'll survive reconciliation. So, I don't think Joe Biden is Roosevelt. What I do hope, and I'll end on this maybe, is that the election coming up in 2022 that Democrats need to win in order to, undertake this decade of decarbonization that we desperately, desperately need. That election will not look like the 2010 election, the last time we had a Democratic administration, which saw huge blowout losses for the Democrats, losing their majority in the House, and that is why we haven't gotten a conversation about climate change in the last decade. So I hope, as skeptical and sort of curmudgeonly as I am about the Biden administration, that enough people will see sort of good things happening in their lives to allow Democrats to keep the House in 2022 and sustain majorities. And that seems up for debate to me right now. And that's, Joe Biden has not built a New Deal coalition in the way that Roosevelt did, and was able to sustain the sorts of transformative changes to the U.S. that he brought up, his administration brought about under massive pressure from social movements.
Waleed, Roosevelt, Biden.
No, I don't think Joe Biden is the new Roosevelt, but I think that FDR becomes a symbol or marker of a way of easily talking about, summarizing that Biden is rejecting in significant ways the old Democratic Party consensus that was prevailing from the Reagan era onward, from 1980s onwards. And so he has not fully stepped into what one might call a realigning presidency, or becoming a realigner himself in the way that FDR was, or Reagan was, or Margaret Thatcher in the UK. But he is rejecting a lot of the deficit hawk. We have to keep government small. Government programs are not the way to go to serve underprivileged, low-income communities, which was his ideology for his whole Senate career. And so I think a lot of what progressives are reacting to is that during the presidential primary in 2020, so much of the progressive talking points about Joe Biden was, look at his record. He voted for the Iraq War. He voted to cut welfare. He voted for NAFTA. He was a champion of the credit card industry. And so when someone like AOC says that he exceeds expectations, I think the context of her remarks are that, well, compared to his whole career as a politician in the Senate, he is actually rejecting the very politics that he himself comes from. And that is significant. But no, I wouldn't say he's fully stepped into the FDR or Reagan role, because that would require a much more full-throated embrace of a progressive populist message. And Biden does not really alienate that many of the most powerful actors in American society yet. If you think about the conservative revolution in the United States, where it goes from someone like Barry Goldwater to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan, you might compare Joe Biden in that long trend of realignment to someone more like Richard Nixon in terms of ideologically not being fully in either camp yet. And someone like Ronald Reagan on the Democratic progressive left side has not yet to emerge on the national level, has not won a national election yet. But Joe Biden, his whole career has represented the median consensus point of Democratic elected officials in Washington. And I think he's representing that consensus point of Democratic elected officials in Washington today. And as more Justice Democrats, Democratic Socialists, progressives continue to win seats in Congress, that median consensus point will continue to shift over time. But right now, the number of seats that Justice Democrats or progressives, strong progressives, probably somewhere between 10 to 30 seats on any given day out of a 435 person body. It's not large enough to command that sort of presence yet, but I think it is significant all the ways that Kate is saying that he is rejecting the politics of yesterday and transitioning to a new form of politics. FDR created Social Security, LBJ created Medicare and Medicaid, huge government programs that people still believe are popular today. For Joe Biden to reach that level of even FDR and LBJ, he would have to create something on that magnitude, which he has not yet done. The child tax credit is probably the closest thing to it, which would cut child poverty estimates say from anywhere between a third to a half. But it's not a permanent program yet. And he has not indicated that he intends to make it a permanent program. So jury is still out on the question, but I do think he's a transitional figure in a lot of ways.
So in terms of, we'll start with, I guess, some more positives on the balance sheet, not specific to Biden per se. I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of the negatives and what comes next. In that, I think some of the reaction I thought to AOC's comments, which I thought were heavily caveated because it was relative, what she said. It was, given what we know about Joe Biden, we would have expected a more conservative administration, but actually it's been more progressive given what we know, is what she was saying. But I thought what I found frustrating, I know a lot of it's just online stuff, but nonetheless, it was revealing. And I suppose this is what I'm interested in, what you both think about this, which is how
there's only online space, Owen, in the pandemic. There's no other space.
No meat space in COVID.
I don't know exactly. That's the thing, actually, because that is the only place that any discussions is happening. So perhaps
public square.
That is the public square, of course. You're right. Is that to say? What I'm interested in is how much has the US left gained? How many concessions have been gained, which would not have happened were it not for the organizing of the US left? And what I find frustrating, I think, about the response is it's saying that don't bother organizing, don't bother mobilizing, because there's been all these mobilizations now for years. The US left has become a permanent and a big political force, and it has achieved absolutely zero. So why bother? I suppose that's what I thought was frustrating. So what have the US left, do you think, specifically gained from this administration, which would not have happened were it not for their efforts?
I mean, I think it's hard to sort of sum all that up, right? Because since the last Democratic president was elected in 2000, since Obama's election in 2008, there's just been so much movement from below that's really changed the whole conversation in ways that I think are tough to like assign to any one demand, right? So 2011, the emergence of Occupy Wall Street, 2013, 14, the movement for Black lives really comes into its own. We see protests against the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. We just see a sort of drumbeat over the last decade, really, of social movements really changing the conversation on a whole host of things. And so that is reflected in the Biden administration, I think, in some pretty concrete ways, right? The fact that Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner were not on the short list for the administration and are not, in fact, in the administration, or really shaping the conversation about economic policy in the way that they had total sort of domination over in the response to the Great Recession is really meaningful, right? There are a sort of new generation of wonks who have come up and are now in places like the Council of Economic Advisors in the administration, who have a very different understanding for what the consensus is, and that has been shaped for the last decade by social movements, right? That has been, a real fight to get things like economic inequality and racial justice put at the center of the policy agenda, and get austerity in the ways that Waleed was talking about really pushed out of the debate. Not that it's gone. I don't think we're done with austerity or neoliberalism, certainly, but I think it's a very different conversation now than has happened. And so those things are all really, really meaningful. We would not get something like the child tax credit 10 years ago. We would not get $1.9 trillion of spending 10 years ago. We would not get, generously speaking, $1 trillion of pledged investment for clean energy and for, toward the climate crisis, as small as that is compared to the scale of the problem, which we know needs, a $10 trillion investment over the next decade, not $1 trillion over 8 years, which is what's being proposed now as the sort of high water mark from the administration, which is, again, just egregiously low given the scale of the climate crisis. But the thing that I struggle with a bit is that the conversation has changed a lot. There's a lot better signals. Even personnel in the administration is really, much more progressive than a decade ago. Those are all, real achievements. I mean, the thing that I struggle with is that we haven't seen that much policy pass, right? I mean, we've seen attempts to sort of roll back the Trump administration. We've seen, obviously, again, the stimulus. I'll just keep bringing that up. It is a huge achievement. But on climate policy, right, we haven't we haven't actually seen anything pass, and we haven't seen, what is it that the administration is really willing to fight for, and that remains to be seen. But we're 100 days in, almost on Thursday. That we're speaking on Tuesday will be the 100-day mark for Biden. And by this point in the Obama administration, we had gotten $90 billion worth of spending for clean energy, and then we don't have anything like that right now. We could get much more, but the fact is we haven't yet. And I do think that there is this sort of strange thing happening where people who have been sort of outside of the halls of power for a very long time through the Trump administration, certainly, but even who were, pretty young under Barack Obama's administration, are having conversations with the White House and, doing the thing that I think is pretty common in sort of social democratic administrations in different parts of the world, in Europe, for instance, whereas there's, an audience being had with progressives from the White House, right, from people like Ron Klain, the chief of staff, but that, I think, can sometimes get confused for power. And for, a real tangible change in policy, which we haven't seen it translate to yet. So I think the two things can be true at once, right? That the Biden administration is absolutely exceeding every expectation and has, is reflective of a much broader shift in what kind of constitutes economic common sense that's come from below. But, we still haven't won a tremendous amount yet, especially on climate.
Waleed, I mean, you've spent years dedicated to organising, getting progressive candidates selected for office within the Democrats. So I suppose what I'm asking is how much of the efforts of people like yourself actually paid off? How much do you think, how much of the progressive side of things can you see have come directly from the organising efforts of people like yourself?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing is that in so many ways, the progressive movement is just getting started. Bernie Sanders ran his campaign in 2016. AOC gets elected in 2018. The squad essentially doubles in 2020. And, the conservative revolution took 25 years to put together, and we're still in the first phase of this progressive revolution happening. And so I don't think that we have been able to deliver the full progressive agenda that Bernie Sanders or AOC believe in, that they want to see enacted. And that is why we need to continue to organize and be involved and get more people elected, win more seats in Congress. In terms of the effect that people have already had, so much of the Biden governing agenda is based on the Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden task forces that were put together after Bernie Sanders removed himself from stepped down from the Democratic primary, and Joe Biden won the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. And progressives were able to have a major impact on those task forces. And much of what's in those task forces are what is being proposed by Joe Biden today, particularly on climate and infrastructure. And so there was the inclusion of a civilian conservation corps modeled on FDR's conservation corps from the 1930s. And Joe Biden has pledged to create that in his infrastructure project, which is a demand that comes from the Sunrise Movement. And the amount of money dedicated to that is way lower than what Sunrise and AOC and progressives are asking for, but it's still a start. And I guess a second point is that they did shave off some of the clean energy targets that Joe Biden had initially proposed. For the first time, probably in American history, we had a Democratic Party candidate whose climate policy moved to the left ahead of the general election. And that is nothing to sneeze at, and is almost solely credited to the work of the Sunrise Movement and of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. The $1,400 checks that were sent out by Joe Biden, that wasn't a guaranteed thing until Bernie Sanders started to actively push for it in the Senate and organize for it. Bernie Sanders is largely to credit for what happened. The parliamentary congressional politics of what's happening today is that when Sanders and Biden created those task forces, the conservative Democrats in the Senate were not part of those negotiations. People like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and Mark Kelly, the most conservative members of the Senate caucus on the Democratic side. And so what's happening today is that Biden will propose essentially what he campaigned on and what was agreed to in those task forces. And then these conservative Democrats will chip away at it. But you have House progressives and Bernie Sanders as a budget chairman holding the line to make sure that what was agreed on does not get significantly watered down to the point that it is no longer effective at delivering results. And so that's also what's happening here in terms of just the congressional math and how these negotiations are playing out. I think Kate is absolutely right that there are significant progressive personnel in the administration, much more progressive than people that President Obama appointed. You even have Biden administration officials going on and off the record dunking on Larry Summers, which I think economic history books will probably cite as a major achievement in progressive economics. Progressives didn't win the entirety of the cabinet, didn't even win half of the cabinet, but there are good people there, particularly people who are closely associated with Elizabeth Warren, Jay Inslee, and Bernie Sanders himself. And you would never have gotten those kinds of appointments to the extent that you've gotten them today under President Obama. So those are some things. And then lastly, I'll say, the pullout from the war in Afghanistan. This is something that progressives for many years have been organizing for, is to, withdraw our troops from Afghanistan after the most prolonged conflict that the United States has ever been involved in. And I don't think anyone expected that President Biden within his first 100 days would do this measure, and the measure is extremely popular with the American public. And so because progressives are largely the foreign policy critics of the American establishment on areas of war and overseas intervention, that is definitely a progressive win.
And one quick thing I would just add that I forgot to mention, along with Bernie Sanders and the Green New Deal, which I wrote a book about. So apologies to that, getting incepted as a centrist. But, we saw this sort of remarkable moment a couple of weeks ago with refugee policy, right? Where the Biden administration announced they were not going to raise the draconianly low refugee cap that the Trump administration had put in place. Mm-hmm. There was public outcry and they reversed the decision, right? They aren't going to raise it. So, I think that's a level of receptiveness that certainly has not happened in the last 4 years. And I think is even really, different than Obama or maybe any administration in recent memory. That, there is a real sense of back and forth between kind of what's happening in kind of progressive policy spaces and on Twitter even, and different parts of the kind of progressive ecosystem and what's happening in the White House. It's really encouraging. And I think is in some senses, given how limited the office of the president is, maybe kind of the best you can hope for, which feels a little strange to say, but I think having a White House which is responsive to pressure is really important. And I think we've only really started to see that happen. I think we have not really, because of COVID in part, seen massive demonstrations in the streets to push the Biden administration to do more. And I think that could really bear a lot of fruit based on what we've seen so far.
I'll just add one more thing about what is happening is, I think Kate alluded to this earlier, there are a lot of people who got their involvement in politics through the Bernie Sanders campaign, including myself largely. And, when you don't have, there's a platform that Bernie Sanders campaigned on that is not the platform of Joe Biden. But to judge Joe Biden solely on the basis that he's not Bernie Sanders is not the best way to assess the political moment, because you have to judge Joe Biden for his own self-interest, his own ideology, his own frameworks, and also judge him on the merits of who he is. And that should inform our strategy versus just being upset that he's not Bernie Sanders. We should all move toward the goals, obviously, of what Bernie Sanders campaigns on and fight for them every day. But there are certain things that Joe Biden is just not going to do fully. So a good example of that is Joe Biden vociferously waged a campaign against single-payer healthcare, and spent a lot of time in the primary talking about how he opposed single-payer healthcare. And so what's been happening in the past few weeks is that Bernie Sanders and the Congressional Progressive Caucus have assembled a coalition that's includes some of the most conservative Democrats and some of the most left-wing Democrats, who are trying to lower the age of Medicare from 65 to 55. Obviously, that is not Medicare for all or single payer, but there is a moment when you can organize these things and push Biden on things that he's actually said he's supportive on, that you can win. It would be pretty historic in the United States context and for Joe Biden to lower the age of Medicare from 65 to 55. And those are achievable things that we should be obviously pushing for, alongside other things. But largely because of the pandemic, and I don't know what it's been like in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, but I'm really interested in hearing about it. But there has been kind of 5 stages of grief to Bernie Sanders not winning the presidential nomination. And because of the pandemic, Bernie Sanders' campaign ended right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so people just haven't been able to process in any way other than through the online forums and tweets and YouTube shows. And I just don't think that necessarily always leads to the best analysis of the current political moment, and leads to a lot of outrage being placed at the feet of progressives, rather than kind of just taking a step back and understanding the political moment we're in and what it means that Bernie Sanders did not win the primary and Joe Biden did.
I'll let you ask about the apocalyptic situation here in Britain when I ask you about where next for the US left. I mean, before I do bring in kind of what comes next, in terms of profound negatives, and you've mentioned good, for example, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and also the fact that pressure did force them away from their very scandalous position on refugees, which was a violation of the commitments that they were going to make. Also movement on union rights, and I think that's extremely important to note as well. But on the downside, there is the issue of the $15 minimum wage, which was a campaign commitment. Obviously, there's the issue of the Senate, so I'm interested to know where that comes into it and what they can actually do about it. And also, there is, for example, they've already dropped bombs abroad, which is something Democrats tend to like doing, if we're going to be historically accurate, from the Vietnam War. Many of the Democrats obviously very vociferously backed the Iraq War. We could go on.
And I don't think you tout your degrees in American history as much as like.
I know, I really should.
Know so much about American politics.
Put them in the bottom. Put them in the bottom next time. But also, yeah, I mean, I'm interested in, for example, the rights of refugees and migrants still. Foreign policy. So where I'm interested in that, the minimum wage issue, and also foreign policy, rights of migrants and refugees, and anything else where you think there was an abject failure from the Biden administration at the moment. Okay.
Yeah.
Waleed, sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, they've largely rejected making immigration a major priority of the administration. Obviously, they've begun to reverse some of the most draconian parts of the Trump administration. But what's been happening in the US context is that Republicans and Fox News are talking about immigration every day, and Joe Biden has kind of ceded that territory to the right because he wants to make the national conversation about infrastructure and the major piece of legislation that he's introducing. But that means that migrant rights continues to be punted on. It's unclear if when immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million plus undocumented Americans who live in this country, when relief for them will become a political reality. But I do think that Joe Biden, it's on guns and on immigration, those are issues they've kind of ceded that they're not going to fully go 100 miles per hour on. So what's happening is that if you look at public opinion polling, the two issues where Joe Biden polls worse with the American people are guns and immigration. That is a combination of factors where, one, voters are only hearing about these two issues from Republicans. Two, there are also people who care about these issues on progressive side and in the mainstream America who are frustrated that Joe Biden, if that's your number one issue, immigration or gun violence, you're frustrated that Joe Biden hasn't taken these things up. And then obviously, the $15 minimum wage, it has been a major disappointment. I don't know how far we can get into the whole reconciliation rules of the Senate and how sometimes when it requires 60 votes and sometimes when it requires 50 votes to get something done. We have a really dumb political system that I would not encourage anyone else adopt. But Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, has said that he is going to fight for a $15 minimum wage to be included in a reconcilable bill. That is a huge test for the administration and a place where this math, parliamentary math, comes into play, where Joe Biden campaigned on delivering $15 minimum wage. It was part of the Sanders-Biden task forces. And then people like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have never supported a $15 minimum wage in their entire careers. And they were elected by their constituents to, not do a $15 minimum wage. So again, this has been such a major Democratic priority for several years that I think this is something that Joe Biden absolutely has to deliver to the American people. Today, he announced that federal contractors will get a $15 minimum wage. So that is through an executive order where he does not have to go through legislation, which is progress. But, it would be a major, major disappointment to all the unions and all the progressive activists and all the workers who deserve a $15 minimum wage if he could not get that done before the 2022 midterms. There's an obvious solution to this, which is to eliminate the filibuster and just get it done. But you still have to deal with those Senate Democrats who currently do not support a $15 minimum wage and never have. So that's some of the math around that.
Kate, in terms of just the out and out profound negatives, what would you say?
Yeah, I think foreign policies you mentioned, with the big exception of finally getting out of Afghanistan, is the place where the sorts of gains we've seen on domestic policy, including on climate, have not really translated. There's a pretty hard core of career State Department, national security officials who are essentially trying to resume business as usual, right? And so what that's translated into is this sort of strange thing where even domestic policy priorities that are fairly progressive, right? Things like a big infrastructure bill are being termed in, are being put in terms of national security, right? And so the big sort of boogeyman of the Biden, parts of the Biden administration and, congressional Democrats even are trying to make out is China. There's been a lot of really hawkish rhetoric around China, which, is a very endlessly complicated issue, of course. But you're seeing things like a climate program, right? Framed in terms of, how are we going to outcompete China and win the future for green energy, which is, it's just sort of a strange thing to look at on its face, someone who covers climate policy, to see things like research and innovation being put in this thing called the Endless Frontiers Act that's going through Congress, or, will come up for a vote at some point soon, to do basic things like investing in basic research, but have it framed as, we have to win this geopolitical fight and sort of creating this enemy, which is this very United States thing to do, right? We're sort of bad at doing big things internally without having some foreign enemy to do it against, right? And so that's really worrying. I think we've seen the kind of human cost of this, sort of nationalistic approach to doing good things domestically already. Having ginning up this fight has, I think has something to do with the fact that we've seen a sort of rash of anti-Asian violence in this country. And, I don't want to sort of overinterpret that, but I don't think it's right to understand those things as separate, right? And so, I think foreign policy is one area where things are really stuck in the past and stuck in these sort of terrible, very US patterns that are, as you mentioned, incredibly bipartisan. And I think one of the places where this is playing out most disastrously is on COVID, right? We're seeing a horrible outbreak in India right now, and the US has not budged on waiving patent protections at the World Trade Organization. This call that's been on the books for months now in the administration to waive patent protections that are, keeping vaccine supply from very vulnerable parts of the world, that is ultimately undermining the world's response and, could come back to bite the U.S. very quickly if it's not dealt with. And the U.S. has not budged on that. In fact, last week, amid sort of growing calls within the U.S., popular calls to finally waive patent protection, saw the Biden administration issue this bizarre statement for World Intellectual Property Day, sort of singing the praises of intellectual property as fueling innovation, which is, this is a whole sort of the rabbit hole we can go down. But, I think the stance of trying to have the U.S. as sort of the dominant power on the world stage, top, of rules-based international order, that is still very much the mindset that the national security foreign policy establishment in Washington is in. And it's really dangerous. I think it is really dangerous. And I don't think that the sort of progress we've seen on domestic policy can be understood as separate from that.
So finally, strategy, US left. What is the strategy? What should the US left be doing now to organise? And what's the future? Who wants to go? Who wants to start? Waleed, I suppose that's your job, I suppose. So what are you going to do?
So the major parts of organizing happening right now is the Democratic Socialists of America have been running an amazing, impressive campaign on the PRO Act, which is would be a historic piece of legislation that would allow workers to unionize more effectively and give them more rights to bargain. And we haven't seen legislation like this in a long, long time in the United States. And so what they've been doing is calling the handful of conservative Senate Democrats. They've been organizing constituents from the states of Virginia and West Virginia and Arizona, and making these phone calls to get these last 3 or 4 senators to sign on to the PRO Act. And this would be a huge win if we could get that passed. And then it would enable us to have even more wins down the line by increasing union density in the United States and having more worker power in this country. Secondly, and so there's a bunch of things like that where we can make calls and from the states that these Senate Democrats are in to pressure them on progressive priorities like the PRO Act, like the $15 minimum wage, et cetera. Secondly, look, we still have to build a bigger squad in the Congress. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are the most progressive senators in the U.S. Senate. And then you have a handful of extremely progressive, social democratic socialist, members of the House of Representatives, people you can see if you go to our website, you can see who we've endorsed, who's currently an elected official. But it's not nearly enough for this long-term transformation that we need of the Democratic Party and of Congress. I was reading this book about the abolitionist movement, and when the abolitionist movement was at its height, 1/3 of Republicans in Congress were essentially aligned with the abolitionist movement. We are nowhere near those numbers in the United States in terms of having, radicals, progressives, really who are willing to fight for working class people to have seats in Congress. And at the end of the day, your power is measured in how many seats you hold. And we still have a caucus that is more dominated by conservative business interests than by progressives who reject corporate money. And then lastly, I would say there's still a major fight to be had on this infrastructure bill. The Sunrise Movement and other organizations are pushing for more robust climate spending in this bill. We all agree, everyone knows that this is our last chance to likely pass major climate legislation for several years in this country. The Biden administration is not going to go back to climate after they pass this bill. And so we have to make the boldest, biggest investments anyone has ever made, to move not only the US, but the world toward 100% clean and renewable energy. And there's going to be a major fight over that in the next few months. It is historic that we are even having the climate investment being in the jobs and infrastructure bill, so that's a win for sure, but we need to make sure that it's bold and aggressive. And then, so I would say those are like the 3 areas. One, making sure people are organizing and calling these conservative Senate Democrats. 2, primarying neoliberal, conservative, corporate-backed incumbents, which is primarily what my organization does, and building that squad up so it's not just 6 people, but 12, 25, 30 people over time. And then lastly is just making sure this infrastructure is as bold and as aggressive as it can be, because this is our last chance.
Okay, what do you think? Strategy?
Well, I would agree with Waleed on all of that. I mean, I'll say two things. I think one is that, you know, we've talked a lot about how far the conversation on a lot of issues has come in the last several years, and that is the result of real disruption, right? In the form of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez winning her congressional election, thanks to Waleed in part, and the Sunrise Movement sitting in at Nancy Pelosi's office, you know, thing that would horrify most congressional staffers and people, you know, eager to maintain their relationships with politicians in Washington, but really changed the conversation. And I think is, you know, a big part of why Sunrise was in the room, right? In crafting these task forces that shaped the Biden administration's governing agenda. So I think the lesson from the last 5 years, or, you know, the last 100 years of U.S. history, is that disruption really works. Really disruptive pressure from below can go a long way. And that is how we get stuff done in U.S. politics. It's not going to come, the sort of action we're going to need on climate, you know, to just go back to my hobby horse, is not going to come from having a lot of nice meetings with Gina McCarthy, the U.S. climate envoy. It's not going to come from having a lot of nice meetings with John Kerry or Ron Klain in the White House, right? It's going to come from making their lives very hard. That is how progressive change has happened in this country historically, by, you know, not just movements from below, but also primary challenges, as Waleed has mentioned. That is how we've gotten so far, and is how we're going to get even farther. And we know that gap is so big when it comes to decarbonization. The sort of scale of what we need to do is just so massive, and we're nowhere near close. None of the best plans on offer from the Biden administration are even close, right, to what's actually needed to addressing the historical responsibility of the United States to dealing with this crisis, to taking on, you know, the real role it should be playing here. And that's really tough. It's a tough road through Congress, but, you know, that needs to happen, and it's not going to happen without a lot of pressure. The other thing I'll say just briefly is that there are a lot of powers that the administration has that, you know, can be influenced by movements at its disposal already that don't need to run through Congress. You know, just for instance, financial regulators, right, can discourage investments in fossil fuels, discourage Wall Street from making investments in fossil fuels with existing powers under Dodd-Frank, under this reform passed after the financial crisis, right? And so there's all of these tools, whether it's on trade policy, sort of throwing the United States weight around in places like the WTO or the IMF or World Bank, that can do a lot of good. And those are tools that the administration has not picked up yet, but it could. And I think that involves a real challenge to capital, that involves, you know, really going up against some very vested interests. But is, you know, what's needed, not least of which on climate, but also, you know, for things like COVID response, is just a sort of bare minimum. So I think picking up more tools than, you know, than the ones that are subject to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema's veto powers is really important.
That was amazing, both of you. Thanks so much. That was, I think, very educational and very appropriate, because it is 100 days afterwards. It is a discussion which is very live, and it needs to be had. And I think that was a very nuanced, thoughtful, factually based discussion that was very helpful and constructive. So what everyone needs to do who is either watching this, wherever you're watching it, or on the podcast, do follow both Kate Aronoff and Waleed Shaheed and buy their books, listen to their work. They're both to the best on the US left. So that's why it's a big honor to have them both on the show and the podcast. So thank you to both of you. Please like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. And I will speak to both of you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Owen. Take care.
Cheers.